Excellent. So, hello everybody. Thanks for joining episode 3 of Visibility in Action. I can't believe we're on to number 3 already. Lots more lined up as well. I'm joined today by Louise Early from Crocon. So, before we dive into anything, why don't you give us a bit of an introduction to kind of who you are and why you're here to talk to us?
Thanks, Dave. I appreciate being part of the series. Excited to be number 3 on your hit list. So as Dave said, my name is Louise Early. I'm the marketing director currently at Crocon. We're a member of the Halma Group. So if you've seen Dave's first podcast, you'll have met Henry, who's another alumni of the Halma group of companies. At Crocon, we make gas detection. So I'm a technical marketer by trade. Having been educated in engineering for many years, I then took a segue into the marketing world.
Excellent, thanks very much. So, yeah, as we said, number 3 in the episodes, and I think there's been a few themes starting to appear in the conversations we're having, but the whole point of this project really is to amplify, LGBT plus voices across STEM, as it says above my head. And yeah, there's a few things that have come up in the chats we've had before recording, Louise, that I wanted to kind of focus on, and you've obviously sent me some kind of topics for us to talk about as well. And I think these will be really, really relevant to a lot of people. And the first one, I think, really is at the start of your career, getting engineering. Like you said, you're in marketing now, but you started as an engineer. And a big topic and a big theme that's come up in the conversations I've had, both in the recordings and the kind of early chats I've had with people that hopefully will appear in later episodes, is how do we prevent dropout, for the LGBTQ plus community generally, but women specifically, who seem to be keen to enter the sector, but also fast to leave for very, very many reasons. And from what you've told me, you've got quite an interesting story there as to how you kind of discovered STEM generally, and the early parts of your career through your education. So it'd be interesting. Yeah, just tell us a bit about that story if you can.
Yeah, sure. So I've always had a keen interest in how things work. So even at primary school, I was taking apart calculators, trying to figure out how the buttons worked, and driving my parents crazy that every other week I was having to have a new one. So it was ingrained very early in me, the who, what, why, how something works, and it was a natural progression for me to take maths and physics into the engineering world, basically. But rather than do the A-level thread, as a lot of my friends were through school, I decided to do the BTEC route and take a more vocational route through to college, which threw up one of my favorite stories, which I shared with you a couple of weeks ago, Dave, which is throughout that OND, we covered all aspects of engineering. So it's everything from electronics to the mechanical, through to welding, CNC programming, computer-aided software. And I think one of the most stark memories that I have is one of the facilities at the college that I went to was off campus, and it was the mechanical facility. And they actually had to put a portaloo outside for me because they had no female facilities. And it wasn't because they didn't want to, it was just because they'd had no demand for it in the past. So it was, I guess it's something that, because I was very lucky to have the support structure in place, my parents were incredibly supportive as I went through this journey of engineering. My grandfather was a mechanic, so it was acceptable. It wasn't something I had to push against within my family life. But when I got to college, it was, wow, I'm the only one here and the only one in my class, and I have no role model to really look to. How do I navigate myself through this? And it was just bullish determination, I think, that got me through that course.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still as amazed at that as when you first told me the story, Louise. It's crazy even just to think that they didn't have the facilities. And I think it goes back to something actually that Henry said in the first episode. He used a phrase which I quite like, which was discrimination by omission, which is people might not necessarily see their acts as discriminatory because they just don't see the issue. They don't notice it's there. And something as basic as a female toilet not being on site is unbelievable, and this wasn't that long ago. you know, when we think about it. And it's funnily enough something that I spoke to someone else who hopefully will be in one of the later episodes, who's actually in Canada, and said the very same thing
Oh, wow.
about their experience too, which was 10 years ago. So it's not exactly fixed itself, let's say. So that's amazing, and I think it leads us on to the next topic, which is that kind of mentorship, those, you know, people to look up to. And that's why this is called Visibility in Action. It's about, you know, showing people that there are people like them in the sector, albeit they've had to overcome hurdles and there's challenges that they face to get where they are. And in very many circumstances, the people I'm talking to are the exceptions to the rule, because you've made it through those challenges and must, you know, and it's about saying, look, if you see yourself somewhere, you're much more likely to see that as a route for your education, your career path. And it sounds like that was something that was really lacking in your experience, that you almost had to push against to kind of keep going, as it were.
Yeah, and I think it's that omission piece again, Dave, because I never had it. I didn't realize I needed it in some respects. And it's since I've been looking back on my career, since I've been looking back on my education, that those things have kind of come out for me. So when I'm thinking about helping generations that are coming after me, those are the things that get cited to me, and those are the things that I try and help with. I'm an active mentor around the Halma group, trying to help others that maybe haven't had the career path options, or haven't had the mentorship or champions that they've alluded to within the career path. And I think it wasn't a detriment to me when I was early in my career, but it's certainly something that I think if I had it would have helped me.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think it's one of the things that might help close the gap, you know, in terms of, you know, equity in the sector as a whole. And I do wonder if it's, now I might get myself into trouble here, if it's more important for certain members of the community, you know. And I say that, for example, sitting here as, you know, someone who identifies as bisexual, but at the same time is a white cis male. So there's a lot of privilege, there's a lot of mentorship, there's a lot of visibility I have in, you know, the sector I work in the same way that there isn't a lot of visibility for women generally, but also for queer women, for trans women, or trans men for that matter, or people, you know, non-binary people, where that mentorship might be even more effective.
Yeah, and I think
Does that make sense?
there's a lot of focus on gender diversity, for example, you know, and that's an area that certainly would benefit, and, you know, would help close that gap of having facilities college for, you know, 16 to 18-year-olds. But I think even more importantly is that layer above it, Dave, that you allude to, as a gay female in engineering. Maybe that's the mentorship, maybe that's the championing that I've not seen, and I still don't have somebody, you know, that I can pull on in my career to offer that recognition of somebody in my guise that has navigated the career paths within an engineering world.
Absolutely. And visibility is really, really powerful, you know, as a tool, even, you know, whether we're talking about it in your day-to-day life, film, TV, all that kind of stuff. But it's when you get to the workplace, you know, it's important to not feel like the only one, you know. And I think a lot of people in the LGBTQ community do. And, you know, if you work for a small company, sometimes there's an inevitability to that, but it's about being able to kind of foster that sense of inclusion, for want of a better phrase, so that you don't feel, you know, excluded because you are the only one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you have a decision to make every time you meet somebody within your work life. Do you come out the minute that you meet somebody and effectively end up coming out every single day of your work life? You know, and we've talked before, Dave, about choosing to do this series with you. But personally, I've never really been overt. You know, my friends know me, my work colleagues know me, but I've never really come out to the general world. And choosing do this now, it's not about me, it's about those that follow. It's about those that might have a simplified path forward because there are other people that they can associate to in the marketplace and in industry and within the Halma group, within my organization.
It's hugely admirable because it's something you're really kind of putting yourself out there to have these conversations so publicly, you know. We'll see how many people watch the video, but it could be nobody. But I hope not. But you're right, it's a huge decision to do that, and kind of like it came up in the first episode in particular, that idea of almost day to day, those decisions that you have to make. Do I come out to this person, whether it's a new colleague, whether it's a client you're talking to, or you know, anyone that you speak to in your day-to-day life? It's that inner monologue that goes on in most, you know, people in the community's heads, frankly, daily, like you say. And professionally, I think it's harder to make that choice because there are repercussions that affect others as well as you, because if someone decides that isn't a good thing, they didn't want to hear that, it damages the business as well, damages your reputation potentially too. So it's a really huge decision to make, and I think that's why I'm so grateful to the people that have been, you know, involved and you know, telling their stories, because like you say, this isn't for us, this is for the people 10, 15, 20 years behind us, to, you know, be able to see that these conversations have been had out in the open, and hopefully make some changes for the better as a result.
I think what's really important is if people feel grounded and open and honest in their working lives as well as their personal lives, they're going to bring extra and added value to the organizations that they're a part of, you know. And there are hundreds of studies out there, you know, that talk about the differences between ambition and gender. And actually it's an area that I researched a number of years ago about how women especially will not apply for roles that they don't fit the job description for, you know, at least 95%, whereas their male counterparts will likely go for something that's 60 to 70% fit. And if you load into that as well other diversity sets, then that just contributes to the factor of not truly being you. And I think it's really important that hiring managers, hiring organizations really look at who a person is and what value they will bring to an organization and where their ambitions could go as opposed to what they're looking for right now. That's where the extra value will be added.
Oh, completely. And you know, getting over that initial application hurdle is one thing, but something else that people have been talking to me about and that I've read a lot about is the idea that, you know, because a lot of the LGBTQ plus community are what we could call invisible diversity, you know, we're only visible when we choose to be, you know, not for everybody, but for a large, you know, proportion of the community. If you have got over the hurdle to apply for the role, you then don't necessarily know if you don't know the response of that company or the culture and policies they might have around the LGBTQ plus community until you meet them face to face. So you have that realization as to whether that yes, they get it or no, they don't in front of them, because you can't see that on a CV, you can't see that on a job spec. And I mean, is that something you've experienced? You know, if you've gone to an interview, or you know, where depends how visible you've chosen to be that early on in a career, I suppose.
Yeah, I think really early on in my career, one of my first jobs in industry, actually, I was part of a very small organization, and part of the reason why they brought me into the organization was my first field sales engineer role. So they brought me in because I was different from a sales engineer point of view. You know, I was probably one of a handful of female engineers in the UK marketplace in the component industry at that time. And you know, the presence and what I brought to the team was very different. But equally, when I left the organization, I was literally told I was a square peg trying to fit into a round hole, and I was too different. And at that point, I wasn't out and open about who I really was. And I think that's what they were sensing, the fact that I wasn't committing my whole self, but that I was different in some way. And maybe I did myself a disservice, but actually the next move I made was to a much more open and friendly and welcoming organization, which really helped me through my career.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's really important, because I think another theme that's been coming up here is early in people's careers, maybe once they've left education, or even once they're still in that system, that's the age when people are wrangling with that kind of self-identity crisis that happens to us all, but particularly to the LGBTQ community. And if you're not in a space that you feel comfortable and open, like you say, to be your full self, then whether you realize it or not, people can sense there's something that isn't quite right. And I think that's also why it's really important for businesses to be able to create those cultures. Because like you said, Louise, if you were hired because you were different, but then the company wasn't able to adapt and make you comfortable there, is that on them or is that on you? Probably on them.
I think there's, I mean, I was certainly holding back at that point in my career, but, having to make a conscious choice of whether to conform to the norm or not. I think that's something that people entering their careers, even when you change role into a new organization, having to make that conscious decision, it just adds a layer of stress and adds a layer of complexity into meeting that new audience of people. And at the end of the day, it's all about people. It's about how you interact with people, how you adapt your messaging to an external audience. It's that true, you are marketing yourself. It's truly marketing.
Yeah.
Understanding your audience, understanding the value you bring to that audience, where to pitch yourself. Do you conform to the norm to fit in, or do you embrace the differences that you are? And having to make that decision at every single interaction it can become quite exhausting, especially early on in your career.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it takes time to have that level of self-confidence to make those decisions as well. Self-confidence that you might think you have at 21, 22, but probably don't. That looking back, you got to go, I wasn't ready to make those decisions, but they're forced upon you, which is probably why they're so exhausting. So I suppose in terms of, we're talking about mentorship, we're talking about creating cultures where people can be open as early as possible. Halma as a group seem to be fairly good at this, at least from someone on the outside looking in and speaking to people from across the spectrum of companies, and they're all different and some are further along that journey than others. What do you feel it is that, in Crocon's case, that they do? Is it something you can put your finger on, or is it, it's hard to define sometimes, but what do you think is different about that culture that does allow it to be open and allow, for example, you to be open and doing something like this?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's about the culture. It's about people respecting each other. It's about the place just being open and a friendly place to work. And I think actually the Halma structure helps that. So we are, a group of 43, 44 autonomous companies. It's not heavily burdened from a corporate landscape. And individual company has its own culture, mindset, with a very allied focus and drive and vision. The safer, cleaner, healthier it drives for every single one of us. And by having that core belief system, I think we attract a certain type of people to the organizations that are within the Halma group, and that's what helps the cultures evolve and become those friendly places to work.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was having a conversation with a couple of people from another Halma company last week, and we were trying to almost define what it is that makes that Halma kind of personality. And the kind of thing we got to, I suppose, was that it's very laid back, very relaxed, very friendly, but also incredibly driven. And that's a tricky balance of traits to find, I suppose. But at the same time, okay, we can talk about, you know, the language of job ads and things attracting men over women if they're written in a certain way, for example, but it's a fairly gender neutral personality type.
Yes.
Halma has been able to create, and the individual Halma companies have been able to kind of take and do their own thing with, that maybe allows that openness and that, you know, range of people to be interested in working for you.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's bred at the opco level.
Mm-hmm.
It's the right person in the right role that will add value and, you know, lead or help the companies prosper and grow. Mm-hmm. That's ultimately the mantra within the organizations, and I think that will be true for all of them.
Yeah, definitely. So almost on the flip side of that, from a recruitment perspective, you know, that's my day job. That's kind of why I'm here. We see, and the reason I started the project really was because so many of the people I speak to day to day are your kind of straight white men of a certain age, making all the decisions. Do you see in the kind of ranks of, you know, technical marketing, product managers, you know, sales engineers, applications engineers, do you start to see a change in the more junior end of the talent pool? Or do you think things have changed that much since when you were starting your career? Is there a broader range when you're hiring?
I guess I'll start with, if a white middle-aged male is the right person for the job, then they're the right person for the job. You know, I'm an absolute advocate for the right people.
Yeah.
To answer your specific question, yes, the talent pool is changing. We are seeing more graduates with STEM qualifications coming through, more, a varied background, willing to try new things and challenge themselves in different ways. Mm-hmm. You know, it's diversity is all inclusive, and it should cover more than just gender.
Yes.
And actually, by having that broad spectrum diversity, that's where the real value starts to get added to an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think companies wanting to start on that kind of diversity and inclusion journey, whatever you want to call it, can be guilty of trying to do so many different things at the same time that they end up doing nothing. So you do tend, you know, you do see people focusing on gender diversity, focusing on, you know, racial or ethnic diversity. I think taking them one at a time is important, because you know, can't necessarily do everything at once, but it's good to hear that change is happening. I mean, I wonder if that change has been driven by the industry, or if it's being driven by the interests of a younger generation. You know, if this is bottom up or top down. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think, you know, ultimately it is about that candidate pool. So it has to be driven from the bottom up, but there has to be appetite from the top down.
Yeah,
is the way that I would view it. So, you know, making sure that organizations are doing the very best they can to help STEM in middle schools, high schools, demonstrate the breadth and the capability of different career paths, so that young people can see what's out there, as opposed to just going down the traditional routes. You know, it's great, and especially in the UK, we're, you know, very lucky to have good technology schools and good technology awareness, and it's about increasing that diverse pool of talent and making sure they're getting the support. You know, industrial placements are a great way for organizations to help with that. STEM ambassadorships are another great way. And then, you know, the graduate programs, especially the Halma graduate program, where graduates can come through, understand the different facets involved in a business, and then choose their career path, I think are extremely rewarding.
Absolutely. But I do think it's great to get people, you know, from all backgrounds introduced to the sector, you know, at an early age. And if they can then see themselves represented in the sector, then that's even more powerful, because I suppose the last thing we want is to get young people interested in onto these placements to then realize, oh wow, the culture of this business totally, you know, prevents me from being myself. So it works both ways. But I think we knew that.
Yeah, but really the learning goes both ways.
Yeah,
You know, the more we work with apprenticeships and STEM and you know, even the HFLs, the Helm of Future Leaders that come through, I learn more about how interacting with people, about how to derive process and projects, and there's just as much value in both directions.
Oh, completely, particularly with technology, which, you know, changes, well, daily. And I think it kind of, it makes me think of the research that we've been seeing published a lot over recent months and talking about the generational demographics of the LGBTQ community, in the sense that 50 years ago, tiny proportion of society, at least in the UK. Now, if we talk about Gen Z, I hate these terms for splitting up people by age, but anyway, if we talk about that, it can be as little as 1/5, as much as a third, or even 40% of people identifying as something other than completely straight. Which means, you know, and some people will say that's, you know, effects that have been put on them and they've made that decision, but actually most people, and I think, you know, you'd agree with me, that actually, no, it's just we're creating a world where people will feel more comfortable to say that. You know, and I think as we start seeing that generation come into the talent pool, hiring managers are going to be forced, they're going to be confronted with that and start having to make changes, because if they don't, people will not want to come and work for them. And that's what it'll come down to. You know, it's almost forcing the change. You know,
and I think it's really important that organizations are demonstrating that inclusive nature, not just saying it.
Absolutely, and we're seeing more than ever, and you know, from the recruitment business side, we see candidates wanting to pick companies because either the internal culture allows them to be themselves, or they see the mission of the company as being relevant to their own kind of morals, for want of a better word. You know, and I think Halma is very good at that, because the vision that you have for, you know, making things safer and healthier and cleaner, it fits very nicely with that kind of scenario. But are you seeing that in the talent pool as well? Not just from obviously LGBTQ people, but generally people are asking more questions about the vision and the culture of a company before making a decision as to whether they want to work for you rather than whether you want to hire them.
Yeah, I think the biggest transition I've seen, especially kind of through the interview process, is making sure that interviews about both sides of the table. Yeah. So is that person right for the organization and the role that we're looking for, and you know, adding skill sets and adding value? And then the other side of the table, and one thing that I'm also very keen on doing when we interview, is this organization right for you? How does it feel for you? You know, even during COVID, can we bring you to the facility so that you can walk around and get the sense of what it's like to be part of this organization, who we are, where we are, meet some wider members of the team? You know, I think the days of having interviews, a first interview with one person, a second interview with one person, maybe a second, are gone. You know, the virtual world has given us the ability to subject interviewees to multiple people all at the same time, which is probably hugely valuable for those people applying for roles, because they get a better sense of the team they're joining and the people, the personalities, and where they can really add that value.
Yeah, I completely agree. And some companies were very good at that before the remote world we find ourselves in, but a lot have been kind of forced into making that change and seeing the benefits from, you know, of it as well, because it allows you to see a more real version of the person you're interviewing as well, because we've all got that interview mask that we put on, and you're never really quite, you know, yourself in that scenario. Whereas if you're able to relax into a situation, it's a bit more conversational, there's a few more people to kind of bounce off. You do that. And I think particularly for people in our community, that's a chance for them to, I suppose, read the room. You know, is this a scenario that I'm going to be comfortable working in? Because, you know, we both know if we've been through the interview process, we're trying to qualify that at every, you know, chance as well. And there goes the dog. I don't know if you can hear him. Someone rang the doorbell. It's the worst possible thing you can do, apparently.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that decision of how much do I give somebody of myself, how much do I let somebody in, even from that very first interaction. And you know, it's such a nerve-wracking thing going to an interview anyway. When do you make the decision to tell them truly who you are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a great point to finish on. And it goes back to a conversation I had actually with Clara, who was in episode 2, where looking at, you know, the diversity and inclusion kind of cultures or kind of promise that companies might put up on their website, it might feel like a tick box. But if people are actually going through the effort of putting that on their website, at least in the application process, you're able, as an LGBTQ plus person, to see that and go, okay, I don't have to have my guard up quite as much if I get through to interview here. You know, like you say, because you're confronted with that decision the first time you meet somebody. At least if that's there, you know, whether it was a tick box or not, there's an element of comfort because they've at least addressed the problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really, really interesting. These are things we could talk about for a long time, I'm sure. But the ultimate aim here is just to, you know, broaden the conversation. So yeah, thanks very much for your time. And I'm sure if anyone wants to ask you any more questions, then you'll be happy to let them connect on LinkedIn or whatever it is people want to do.
Thank you for doing the series, Dave. I think it's a really important message, getting this out to a wider audience, you know, building that talent pool, letting people know that people have been through it before them. I think is a really important aspect of this. So thank you very much for doing the series.
Oh no, appreciated, Louise. Thanks. That's, you know, the two things this is trying to do is create that visibility and that mentorship, as you say, and also put these conversations in front of people that might not otherwise seek them out. And hopefully we're able to do both. So yeah, thanks very much.